there. I'm sure that the questions directed to him, we hope, subject to Bob's magical works, that we will have him live to take some questions. But what we propose to do is to continue with the next presentation and take the questions towards the end, so we have a decent time for discussion. The next presenter is Alice Whitaker. Alice leads the Tier 1 Environment and Climate Group at Philippine, where she is a partner. She has maritime area planning expertise through 2 decades of work for the Marine Institute, for the Commissioners of Irish Lights, Aquacoms, RWE, Port of Cork, Mainstream Renewable Power, State Energy Authority of Ireland, and a number of coastal planning and harbour authorities. So, Alice Whitaker is here with us. Thank you.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, super. Great to actually be able to talk to you all in person. This is my first event with more than about 3 people in one room, so I'm still bound to my mask. So I will try and talk to you. I was given, I think, 5 minutes or less, and an allocation of 2 slides to talk about a 270-page piece of legislation, so I'm going to do my very best. The Marine Area Planning, or Maritime Area Planning Act, I should say, was adopted just before Christmas, and it's a fairly fundamental piece of legislation that is going to govern all of the offshore wind activity into the future. And I'm just going to try and touch really on 4 aspects of it, the different types of consents or permissions that are going to be available under it, and opportunities for public participation in relation to those types of applications. So the first really issue is that, or opportunity, is that there's going to be a new Maritime Area Regulatory Authority. So this is a brand new authority that's going to be established, hopefully by very early next year, and it will have quite an extensive remit to handle the issuing of what are called marine area consents, which I just keep saying marine, maritime area consents. And if I can it's just done, but if we just see, at the moment what we have is a foreshore consent regime, so foreshore licenses and foreshore leases, where the permission to develop and the property interest in the area are combined into a single consent. So developers are given a right to occupy an area and develop it at the same time in a single consent. What the maritime area consent will do is just grant an interest to occupy an area, but it doesn't grant consent to develop that area. So there's going to be a separate consent obligation to look for permission to develop within the maritime area consent area, if that makes sense. So MARA will just deal with the property aspect, whether or not a developer has the financial and technical wherewithal to properly and sustainably hold and occupy a maritime area. In most cases, not on an exclusive basis, they'll have to share the area and coexist, but in some cases it will be on an exclusive basis for a set period of time and for a very specific purpose. So MARA will also take over the handling of licensable activities. So what licensable activities are temporary, activities like survey and research and the placing of aviation aids, things like that are currently covered by a foreshore license. And they will also take over the management and handling of foreshore leases and licenses that would have been granted in the past, and they're going to kind of keep a register of those and maintain those and ensure that they are managed and regulated appropriately. And then fundamentally, then it will also, probably for the first time, actually have an enforcement function. so that if there's a breach of any of the conditions of maritime area consent or a licence, MARA will have an enforcement role, which, to be honest, doesn't really exist. I mean, there's theoretical enforcement, but there isn't really an enforcement body in the maritime area for consenting, so this will be a new important role that MARA will have. Now, before MARA is established, the Minister under the Act now will have kind of temporary powers to grant marine area consents to specific projects, and those are projects that you can call them relevant projects, legacy projects, and there's a variety of different terms, but they are projects that either already were granted a lease to carry out an offshore renewable development, or had a very substantially advanced application, or that had a grid connection offer granted before a certain period of time. And the Minister can invite a marine area consent application from those specific projects, and will have a power, if he or she so thinks it's the correct thing to do, to grant a marine area consent just to those projects. But the Minister will have no power to invite or grant marine area consents to any other offshore renewable projects. That will always be MARA. So, as I mentioned, a marine area consent is just a conditional interest in the maritime area. So, it enables an application for development consent to be made, but if that application is unsuccessful, then the marine area consent automatically terminates. Am I screeching? Sorry. As I mentioned, a marine area consent is a precondition to applying for, even actually it's a precondition to commencing pre-application consultation with a planning authority or onboard Planola. So you literally can't do anything in relation to a planning application until you have a marine area consent. But when an application is ready to be made, there's two bodies that will deal with development permission applications. Onboard Planola will be responsible for any applications relating to development in what's called the outer maritime area. So by default, that is the area beyond 3 kilometres from the high water mark. But it will also have sole responsibility for what you would call Schedule 8 developments, which are strategic infrastructure development types that will be located in the maritime area, whether or not they are beyond 3 kilometres or on what's called the near shore. So that class of kind of strategic development will also fall within the planning board's remit, and that will include offshore wind. The coastal planning authority, so in this case Dunleary, will have functions in relation to the near shore area. Now, the near shore by default is the 3 kilometre area, literally a straight line from the boundary of the local authority, but the Minister will have the power to designate the near shore. That will be the responsibility of the Coastal Planning Authority. So the Minister actually has the power to designate a narrower or wider area, or to maybe designate, for example, Dunleary as being the Coastal Planning Authority for the whole of Dublin Bay. So you can kind of nominate a Coastal Planning Authority. And the environmental impact assessment and appropriate assessment process under the Habitats and Birds Directive, that kicks in at the development consent stage. So the assessment of the environmental impacts of proposed projects occurs as part of the planning and the development permission application, not as part of the marine area consent process. With this one exception, which is the licensing. So I mentioned licensable activities are sort of more minor, temporary, they're like non-development activities. They're not permanent works. So there's a list of them in Schedule 7 of the Act, and so it would include things like maritime site investigations and surveys. And it's MARA that will grant those licenses, and MARA is given the power to carry out appropriate assessment, which is the assessment of significant effects on European sites designated under the Birds and Habitats Directive, but it will have no function in relation to anything that would require an environmental impact assessment. So the type of larger projects that could have a significant environmental effect that are listed in the EIA directive. So, for example, an offshore wind farm is a project that would require EIA. So MARA has no function there in relation to EIA. So if a license application is put in and it's determined that EIA is required, the developer will be sent away and told to go off and get planning permission, not a license. So the Minister then will have power to make regulations under the Act, and those regulations could exempt certain activities from the requirement for a licence, but any regulations that would seek to exempt certain activities would be subject to screening under the SEA directive and the Habitats directive in advance of being adopted. So it's unclear whether there will be any exempted activities or not, but that power is there. And as I mentioned, the Minister will have no power to grant a licence. So there's no sort of interim power there to grant a licence. Only MARA is being given that power. So until MARA is established, the Foreshore Acts will continue to be enforced. So anybody looking to carry out those sort of activities will require a foreshore licence until those new provisions are commenced. And so in terms of when the public can get involved, say in relation to offshore projects, there's a number of kind of opportunities, I guess, and obviously informal opportunities like this in terms of discussing things, but formally there will be, under the Maritime Area Planning Act, maritime spatial planning. So you might be aware of the National Marine Planning Framework, which is sort of like the National Development Plan for the maritime area. That was adopted during the course of last year, but there's an obligation to review that periodically, and there's a power under the Act to adopt maritime spatial plans, which will be almost like your development plan, but for the maritime area, designating areas that might be appropriate for certain types of activity. And maritime spatial plans can be adopted for a very specific area or for a specific sector or nationally. So there will be public participation in the context of that sort of plan-making function. There's also going to be the possibility of what we call designated maritime area plans, or DMAPs. And those are plans that are a little bit like, I guess a little bit like an SDZ, like the Cherrywood SDZ. They're going to be, they could be maybe for a whole harbour area and setting out,